The dust hadn't even settled on her worn traveling dress when Eleanor Walsh realized she had made a terrible mistake coming to Marysvale, Utah with nothing but hope and $18 to her name. Now, 3 weeks later, in the sweltering August heat of 1882, she sat at a corner table in the Silver Spur Saloon counting out her last 3 coins with trembling fingers, wondering if she had enough for one more meal or if this was finally the end of the road. The copper pennies clinked against the scarred wooden table as she arranged them in a small circle, her stomach twisting with hunger and shame. 2 pennies and 1 nickel. 7 cents between her and complete destitution. The saloon wasn't crowded at this hour, just past noon, but Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares on her back. A woman alone in a saloon was unusual enough, but a woman clearly down on her luck was either an object of pity or suspicion, and she didn't care for either. She had come west after her father died, leaving behind a mountain of gambling debts in Philadelphia that his creditors seemed to think she should pay. Her aunt in Salt Lake City had promised work as a seamstress, but when Eleanor arrived, she found the woman had moved to San Francisco 6 months prior without leaving a forwarding address. Marysvale had seemed like a reasonable place to stop and earn enough money to continue her journey, but the town's 2 dress shops had no need for another seamstress, and respectable work for a single woman was scarce as water in the desert. "What can I get you, miss?" Eleanor looked up to find a barkeeper watching her with weary eyes that had seen too many desperate souls pass through his establishment. He was wiping down a glass with a rag that had probably been white once upon a time. "I was wondering," she began, hating how small her voice sounded, "what 7 cents might buy." The barkeeper's expression softened with pity, which somehow felt worse than contempt. "Well, now, that's a difficult question." "Perhaps just some bread," Eleanor said quickly. "I don't need much." Before the barkeeper could answer, a shadow fell across her table. Eleanor looked up to find a man standing there, tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of desert sage. He wore dusty chaps over well-worn denim, a faded blue shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. A working cowboy, she surmised, probably one of the many who moved cattle through the area. There was something solid about him, something steady in the way he stood that made her think of oak trees and bedrock. "Your money's no good here," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush hot. "I beg your pardon?" "I said your money's no good here." He gestured to her 3 coins. "Tom, bring the lady a proper meal. Steak, potatoes, whatever vegetables you've got that haven't turned, and coffee, the strong stuff." "Now wait just a moment," Eleanor protested. But the cowboy had already pulled out a chair and seated himself across from her without invitation. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the stubble on his strong jaw, the way his calloused hands rested easily on the table. He couldn't have been more than 26 or 27, but there was something weathered about him that spoke of hard living and harder lessons learned. "Name's Bennett Cole," he said, pulling off his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Most folks call me Ben." "Mr. Cole, I appreciate the gesture, but I cannot accept charity from a stranger." Eleanor tried to sound firm, but her rebellious stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, undermining her dignity. Ben's mouth quirked up at one corner. "Who said anything about charity? I'm a businessman making an investment." "An investment in what exactly?" "In you, miss." He paused, waiting. "Walsh. Eleanor Walsh." She hesitated, then added, "Though I fail to see how I could possibly be a worthwhile investment, I have no money, no prospects, and no skills that seem to be of any use in this town." "What skills do you have?" Eleanor counted them off on her fingers. "I can sew, embroider, keep accounts, read and write in English and passable French, play the piano adequately, and according to my late mother, I make an excellent apple pie. None of which seems particularly valuable in a Utah mining town." Ben leaned back in his chair, studying her with those steady, sage-colored eyes. "The Garrett Ranch is about 8 miles northwest of here. Biggest cattle operation in this part of Utah. My brother Cal and I run it, inherited it from our father 2 years back. We've got 12 men working for us, and not one of them can sew on a button to save his life. Our cook, Frank, is good with steaks and beans but hasn't made a pie in his entire life. And our accounts are currently being kept on scraps of paper stuffed into an old cigar box because neither Cal nor I have the patience for bookkeeping. You're offering me employment? Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. I'm offering you a position as the ranch housekeeper and bookkeeper. You'd have your own room in the main house, 3 meals a day, and $30 a month. That's more than fair wages. It was more than fair, it was generous. Was Eleanor's instincts, sharpened by 3 weeks of hardship and a lifetime of her father's bad decisions, told her to be suspicious. Why would you offer employment to a complete stranger? Ben was quiet for a moment, his expression turning serious. 6 months ago, my sister Lily showed up at the ranch in similar circumstances to yours. She'd been living in Denver with her husband, or so we thought. Turned out the man wasn't her husband at all. Just a con artist who'd taken her money and left her stranded. She was too ashamed to wire us for help, tried to make her own way. By the time she got to the ranch, she was half-starved and sick with fever. Nearly died. His jaw tightened. She's recovered now. Married to a good man in Salt Lake City. But I'll never forget how she looked that day, so proud she could barely ask for help, counting out her last few coins like they were gold. Eleanor felt her throat constrict with unexpected emotion. I'm sorry about your sister. Don't be sorry, just let me buy you a meal and offer you honest work. What you do with it is your choice. Tom, the barkeeper, arrived with a plate loaded with food, the aroma of grilled steak and fresh bread making Eleanor dizzy with hunger. He set down the plate along with a steaming cup of coffee, then retreated with a knowing look. Eleanor stared at the food, her pride warring with her desperate circumstances. She could refuse, walk out with her head held high and her 3 coins intact. And then what? She had nowhere to go, no prospects, and winter was only a few months away. Pride wouldn't keep her warm. Pride wouldn't fill her stomach. I'll work hard, she said quietly. I promise you won't regret this. I know I won't. Now eat before it gets cold. Eleanor picked up her fork with shaking hands and took her first bite of the steak. It was tender and perfectly seasoned, and she had to blink back tears as she chewed. She hadn't realized how close to breaking she had been until someone had shown her kindness. She forced herself to eat slowly, to maintain some semblance of manners despite wanting to devour everything on the plate like a starving wolf. Ben sat quietly across from her, sipping his own coffee and not staring, which she appreciated. He seemed comfortable with silence, something Eleanor found refreshing after a lifetime of her father's nervous chatter and elaborate excuses. When would I start? She asked between bites. Today, if you're willing. I've got a wagon outside. We can collect your things and head out to the ranch. That won't take long. Everything I own fits in one small trunk. Eleanor paused, then forced herself to ask the question that had been nagging at her. Mr. Cole, you mentioned your brother. Will he be agreeable to this arrangement? I wouldn't want to cause discord. Cal trusts my judgment. Besides, he'll be so relieved to have someone organize that disaster of a bookkeeping system that he'd probably hire a trained bear if it could hold a pencil. Eleanor found herself smiling despite her circumstances. I assure you I'm more qualified than a bear, though perhaps not by much given my recent fortunes. Your fortunes are about to change, Miss Walsh. Ben said it with such certainty that Eleanor almost believed him. She finished her meal, savoring every bite, then drained her coffee cup. Ben left money on the table, far more than the meal cost, and held the door for her as they stepped out into the brilliant Utah sunshine. The heat was oppressive after the relative cool of the saloon, and Eleanor raised a hand to shield her eyes. Ben's wagon stood at the hitching post, a sturdy vehicle pulled by 2 patient-looking horses. He helped her up onto the seat with easy courtesy, his hand warm and strong as it steadied her arm. They rode to the boarding house where Eleanor had been staying, depleting her funds day by day. The proprietress, Mrs. Henderson, looked relieved to see her leaving with her trunk paid for and no drama. As they rolled out of Marysvale with Eleanor's trunk secured in the wagon bed, she took what she thought might be her last look at the town. It hadn't been kind to her, but it had led her to this moment, to this opportunity. She settled back against the hard wooden seat and tried not to think about all the ways this arrangement could go wrong. The landscape rolled past in shades of red and gold, the distant mountains purple against the endless blue sky. Ben drove with relaxed competence, the reins easy in his hands. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled, a natural rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, a creek bed that ran full in spring but was bone dry now in late summer. "How long have you been in Utah?" Eleanor asked, curious about this quiet man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't quite dared to voice. "All my life. My parents came out here in '58 before I was born. My father had dreams of striking it rich in the mines, but he was smarter than most prospectors. He realized that the real money wasn't in digging for gold, but in feeding the men who did. He started with a small cattle operation, built it up year by year. By the time he died, the Garrett Ranch was one of the most successful in the territory." "The Garrett Ranch? But your name is Cole." "It was the Garrett Ranch when my father bought it from the original owner, and he saw no reason to change the name. Said it already had a reputation, and that was worth more than pride." Ben's expression grew distant. He was a practical man in most things. There was something in his tone that suggested complications, but Eleanor didn't pry. She had her own complicated feelings about her late father, and she recognized that particular brand of mixed grief in others. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking and the horses' hooves thudding against the packed earth. Eleanor felt herself beginning to relax for the first time in weeks, the tight knot of anxiety in her chest loosening slightly. She wasn't safe yet, wasn't secure, but she had a destination and a purpose, and that was more than she'd had that morning. The ranch came into view gradually, first as a distant cluster of buildings shimmering in the heat, then resolving into a substantial homestead. The main house was a 2-story structure built of local stone and timber with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and one side. Outbuildings dotted the property, including a large barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse, and various storage sheds. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, their forms small against the vast landscape. As they drew closer, Eleanor could see men working, mending fences, tending horses, engaged in the dozens of tasks required to keep a ranch running. Several looked up with undisguised curiosity as Ben drove the wagon past them toward the main house. A man emerged from the barn as they pulled up, taller than Ben by a few inches and broader through the shoulders. He had the same dark hair and sun-bronzed skin, but his eyes were darker, nearly black, and his expression was more guarded. "Cal?" Ben called out as he set the brake. "Come meet our new housekeeper." Cal approached with long strides, his gaze assessing Eleanor in a way that made her sit up straighter. "Ben, could I have a word?" "You can have several. Eleanor, this is my brother, Caleb. Cal, this is Miss Eleanor Walsh. She'll be handling the books and helping Frank with the household management." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance, determined to prove she wasn't some delicate Eastern flower who couldn't handle herself. She extended her hand to Caleb. "Mr. Cole, I hope my presence won't be an inconvenience." Caleb shook her hand, his grip firm but brief. "Ben makes these decisions without consulting me, then expects me to go along with them." "Usually because you know I'm right," Ben said mildly, but there was an edge to his tone. "I'll work hard and stay out of your way," Eleanor said quickly, sensing tension between the brothers. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." Caleb studied her for another long moment, then his expression softened slightly. "You look like you've had a rough time of it." "I have, but I'm hopeful that's behind me now." "Well, Ben's usually a good judge of character, even if his methods are unorthodox. Welcome to the Garrett Ranch, Miss Walsh." Caleb nodded to his brother. "Show her to Lily's old room. I'll let Frank know we'll have an extra person at dinner." He strode off toward what Eleanor assumed was the kitchen, leaving her alone with Ben. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "He seems protective," she said carefully. "He is. We've had some trouble with hired hands who didn't work out, and Cal tends to assume the worst until proven otherwise. Don't take it personally." Ben lifted her trunk from the wagon as if it weighed nothing. "Come on, I'll show you the house." The interior was cooler than outside thanks to thick stone walls and strategically placed windows that caught any breeze. The main room was spacious, dominated by a large stone fireplace and furnished with solid, practical furniture that had seen years of use. Everything was clean but had a distinctly masculine feel, as if the house had been without a woman's touch for some time. Ben led her up a staircase to the second floor, down a hallway, and stopped at a door. "This was Lily's room. We haven't changed anything since she left." He opened the door to reveal a pleasant room with a window overlooking the front pastures. There was a bed with a simple quilt, a dresser with a mirror, a wardrobe, and a small writing desk. All, compared to the boarding house room Eleanor had been renting, it was palatial. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Ben set her trunk at the foot of the bed. "Dinner's at 6. You're welcome to settle in and rest before then, or I can show you around the property if you're up for it." Eleanor was exhausted, but she didn't want to give either Ben or his brother any reason to think she was lazy. "I'd like to see the property, if you don't mind. The sooner I understand how the ranch operates, the sooner I can be useful." Something that might have been approval flickered in Ben's eyes. "All right then, let's start with the barn." They spent the next few hours touring the ranch, and Eleanor tried to absorb everything Ben told her. She met Frank, the cook, a grizzled man in his 50s with kind eyes and flour permanently embedded under his fingernails. She saw the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived, a long building lined with narrow beds. She learned about the different pastures, the water sources, the seasonal patterns of the cattle business. The ranch hands they encountered were respectful but curious, clearly wondering about her presence. Ben introduced her simply as the new housekeeper and bookkeeper, and his matter-of-fact tone discouraged questions. By the time they returned to the main house, Eleanor's head was spinning with information and her feet ached in her worn boots, but she felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Purpose. Frank had prepared a substantial dinner of roasted chicken, potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread. Eleanor, Ben, and Caleb ate together in the dining room, an awkward affair where conversation came in fits and starts. Caleb asked polite questions about her background, and Eleanor gave carefully edited answers that left out the most humiliating details of her father's debts and her desperate journey west. After dinner, Ben showed her the office where the ranch records were kept, if you could call it that. Papers were indeed stuffed into a cigar box, along with receipts crammed into drawers, notes scribbled on whatever surface was handy, and a general sense of chaos that made Eleanor's organized mind ache. "This is going to take me at least a week to sort out," she said, surveying the disaster. "Take as long as you need. Neither Cal nor I have the temperament for it." Ben leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "You sure you're up for this? It's a lot of work." "Mr. Cole, I've spent the last 3 weeks wondering if I would starve or freeze come winter. Organizing paperwork is hardly a hardship in comparison." "Fair enough. And Eleanor?" She looked up at the sound of her first name, noting that it was the first time he'd used it. "You don't have to prove anything. You're not on trial here." But she felt like she was. She needed this position to work out, needed it with a desperation that made her chest tight. "I'll still do my best." "I know you will." He straightened. "Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch." Eleanor did rest, falling into the most comfortable bed she'd slept in since leaving Philadelphia. She woke to the sound of roosters and men's voices drifting up from outside, the sky just beginning to lighten with dawn. She dressed quickly in her most practical dress, pinned her dark blonde hair into a severe bun, and made her way downstairs. Frank was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the ranch hands who ate in shifts. He looked surprised to see her. "Thought you might sleep in your first morning," he said, flipping pancakes on a large griddle. "I'm used to early hours. Can I help?" Frank looked at her appraisingly, then gestured to a basket of eggs. Know how to scramble eggs for 20 men? I can learn. And learn she did. Frank proved to be a patient teacher, and Eleanor found herself falling into a rhythm in the warm kitchen. When Ben came in for breakfast, he found her serving plates alongside Frank, her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of flour on her cheek. Something in his expression shifted when he saw her there, something Eleanor couldn't quite read but that made warmth bloom in her chest nonetheless. The days began to establish a pattern. Eleanor rose early, helped Frank with breakfast, then spent her mornings tackling the nightmare of the ranch accounts. She had a natural aptitude for numbers, and the work, while tedious, was satisfying. She created a proper ledger system, categorized expenses, identified patterns in spending that revealed inefficiencies Ben and Caleb hadn't noticed. In the afternoons, she helped with household tasks, mending clothes for the ranch hands, organizing storage spaces that had been neglected, making lists of supplies needed from town. Frank taught her to cook for a crowd, adjusting her delicate Eastern recipes to the hearty fare expected by working men. Evenings, she often found herself on the porch with a basket of mending, watching the sun set over the mountains while Ben or Caleb, or sometimes both, would join her, drinking coffee and sharing the day's events. Caleb's initial wariness gradually faded as Eleanor proved her competence and work ethic. He even smiled at her occasionally, though he remained more reserved than his brother. Ben was different. As days turned into weeks, Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of his presence, the way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size, the sound of his laugh, rare but genuine, like sun breaking through clouds, the calluses on his hands and the strength in his arms when he lifted heavy supplies, the careful way he listened when she talked, as if her words mattered. She tried to tell herself it was simply gratitude, appreciation for the man who had rescued her from destitution. But gratitude didn't explain why her pulse quickened when he entered a room, or why she found herself watching for him through the kitchen window as he worked with the horses, or why she lay awake some nights remembering the way his hand had felt when he helped her down from the wagon that first day. It was dangerous, these feelings. She was an employee, dependent on the Cole brothers' goodwill for her survival. Getting emotionally entangled with her employer was foolish at best, disastrous at worst, but her heart seemed unconcerned with practical considerations. One evening in late September, nearly a month after her arrival, Eleanor sat on the porch with her mending as usual. The air had finally begun to cool with the approach of autumn, the brutal summer heat giving way to pleasant evenings. Ben emerged from the barn and headed her way, and Eleanor's treacherous heart did its now familiar leap. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, holding up a cup of coffee. "Of course not. It's your porch." He settled into the chair beside her, stretching out his long legs with a contented sigh. "Frank said you made stew tonight. Best thing he's tasted in years, according to him." Eleanor felt herself blush with pleasure at the compliment. "He's being generous. I simply followed his recipe." "He said you improved it." Ben took a sip of his coffee, then looked at her directly. "You've done more than we hoped for, Eleanor. The books are in order, the household runs smoothly, the men's clothes aren't held together with prayers anymore. Cal and I appreciate it. I'm glad I can be useful." She focused on the shirt she was mending, a button replacement that required concentration she didn't really need. "I've been meaning to ask," Ben continued, his voice casual but with an undertone she couldn't identify. "Are you planning to stay? Or is this just temporary until you've saved enough to move on?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. She'd been so focused on surviving day to day that she hadn't thought much about the future. "I suppose that depends on whether you want me to stay." "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't care about the answer." Eleanor set down her mending and looked at him, finding him already watching her with those steady, sage-colored eyes. In the fading light, his face was all planes and shadows, strong and honest. "I don't have anywhere else to go, Ben. No family left, no home to return to. If you and Caleb are satisfied with my work, I'd like to stay as long as you'll have me." "Good." The word was quiet but fervent, and Eleanor's breath caught at the intensity behind it. Ben seemed to realize he'd revealed too much, because he looked away, clearing his throat. That's good. We'd hate to lose you. They sat in silence for a while, but it felt charged somehow, heavy with words unsaid. Eleanor picked up her mending again, but her hands weren't quite steady. Can I ask you something? Ben said eventually. Of course. That first day in the saloon, when I found you counting those 3 coins, what were you planning to do after you ran out of money, I mean? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, remembering the desperation of that morning. I don't know. I'd thought about trying to work my way to California, perhaps hiring on as a cook for a wagon train or finding some other traveling situation. I'd thought about writing to distant cousins back east, begging for help, even though we'd never been close. Mostly, I tried not to think about it at all because every option seemed impossible. And if I hadn't shown up, then I suppose I would have had to get creative. I've heard there are women who make their way in this world through means I would prefer to avoid, but when faced with starvation, preferences become luxuries. She said it matter-of-factly, but the reality of how close she'd come to that fate made her voice tight. Ben's jaw clenched. You would have found another way. Perhaps, but I'm grateful I didn't have to. Eleanor looked at him directly. You saved my life that day, Ben. I haven't said that plainly enough, thank you. You don't need to thank me. I do, though. You saw a stranger in trouble and helped without expecting anything in return. That's not as common as it should be. Ben was quiet, studying his coffee cup. I told you about my sister Lily. What I didn't tell you was that she almost didn't ask for help. When she finally showed up at the ranch, she'd been trying to survive on her own for 2 months. She'd gotten thin and sick and desperate, but her pride nearly killed her because she didn't want to admit she needed help. When I saw you in that saloon, I saw her, and I thought, not again. I won't watch another woman suffer because the men around her are too blind or too selfish to step up. The raw emotion in his voice struck something deep in Eleanor's chest. She reached out without thinking, placing her hand over his on the arm of his chair. His skin was warm and rough, his hand so much larger than hers that it seemed impossible. Your sister is lucky to have you, she said softly. Ben turned his hand over, capturing hers, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that sent sparks racing up her arm. I'm the lucky one. You being here, it's been good for the ranch, good for Cal and me, good for Frank. The whole place feels different, more like a home, and less like just a work camp. Ben, Eleanor started, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing she needed to say something. The moment shattered as Caleb's voice called out from inside. Ben, we've got a problem with the east fence. Some of the posts are down. Ben released her hand and stood, the spell broken. I'll be right there. He looked down at Eleanor, and there was an apology in his eyes. I should go. Of course. He headed inside, leaving Eleanor alone on the porch with her heart racing and her hands still warm from his touch. She sat there in the gathering darkness, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions in her chest. It would be so easy to fall for him, this quiet cowboy who had appeared in her darkest hour like a hero from a storybook. But real life wasn't a story, and she'd learned the hard way that depending too much on another person was dangerous. Still, as she gathered her mending and headed inside, she couldn't stop thinking about the way his thumb had traced across her knuckles, or the look in his eyes when he'd asked if she was planning to stay. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as the ranch prepared for winter. The cattle had to be moved to lower pastures, supplies had to be laid in, repairs had to be made before the cold weather set in. Everyone worked long hours, and Eleanor often fell into bed exhausted. But through it all, she was aware of Ben. The way he looked at her across the dinner table. The way he found excuses to talk to her, asking about the accounts or the supply orders but staying to chat about other things. The way his hand would brush hers when he passed her something, contact that lasted just a moment too long to be accidental. She knew the ranch hands had noticed. She caught knowing looks passing between them, heard conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Frank was the worst, making pointed comments about how nice it was to see young people getting along, how the ranch could use some more life and laughter. Caleb surprisingly said nothing. He watched his brother and Eleanor with those dark eyes that missed nothing. But if he disapproved, he kept it to himself. One crisp October morning, Eleanor was in the office working on the monthly accounts when Ben appeared in the doorway. "How do you feel about writing?" he asked without preamble. Eleanor looked up from her ledger, surprised. "I learned as a girl, but I'm not sure I'd call myself an accomplished writer. Why?" "I need to check on the herd in the north pasture, and I thought you might like to see more of the ranch. You've been cooped up in this office too much." It was true. Eleanor had been working long hours to finish organizing the accounts before the end of the month, and she hadn't ventured far from the main house in days. The prospect of an outing, especially with Ben, made her pulse quicken. "I'd like that," she said, "but I'm not sure I have appropriate clothing for writing." Lily left some things in her wardrobe. "You're about the same size. I'm sure she wouldn't mind you borrowing them." 20 minutes later, Eleanor found herself dressed in split riding skirts and a warm jacket, both well-made and practical. Ben had saddled 2 horses, a gentle mare for Eleanor, and a larger gelding for himself. He helped her mount with patient instruction, his hands steadying her waist in a way that made her intensely aware of his strength. The ride out to the north pasture was beautiful. The aspens had turned golden, brilliant against the deep blue sky. The air smelled of sun-warmed earth and pine, crisp and clean. Ben rode beside her, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the ranch, and Eleanor felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. They found the herd grazing peacefully, spread out across a broad meadow. Ben dismounted to check on a few of the cattle, and Eleanor watched him work with quiet competence. The way he approached the animals calmly, examined them with practiced efficiency. He was in his element out here, she realized, more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. When he was satisfied that all was well, they stopped by a stream to let the horses drink. Ben helped Eleanor down from her mare, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. They stood close together, and Eleanor could see the golden flecks in his sage eyes, the exact curve of his mouth. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and rough, "I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "What is it?" "When I saw you in that saloon, counting those coins with such dignity even though you were clearly at the end of your rope, something shifted in me. I told myself I was just helping someone in need, like I'd want someone to help Lily. But it wasn't just that." He reached up, tucking a strand of hair that had escaped her bun behind her ear, his fingers gentle against her cheek. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. The way you face every challenge without complaining, the way you've made the ranch feel like a home, the way you laugh at Frank's terrible jokes and how you're patient with the ranch hands when they bring you clothes to mend, the way you look in the morning light and how you bite your lip when you're concentrating on the accounts, and the sound of your voice when you read aloud on the porch in the evenings." Eleanor couldn't breathe. "Ben, I know this is complicated. You work for me, and I don't want you to feel pressured. But I also can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. I care about you, Eleanor. More than I should, probably. More than is smart. But there it is." For a moment, Eleanor couldn't find words. Then everything she'd been holding back came tumbling out. "I care about you, too. I've been trying not to, trying to be professional and practical, but I can't help it. You're kind and strong and honest, and when you look at me, I feel like I matter. Like I'm not just surviving anymore, but actually living." Ben's expression transformed, hope and joy breaking across his face like sunrise. He cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "Can I kiss you?" "Please," Eleanor whispered. His mouth met hers, soft and searching, a question and an answer all at once. Eleanor's hands came up to grip his shirt, anchoring herself as the world seemed to tilt and realign around this moment, this man, this kiss that felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ben rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks. I've wanted you to." They stood there by the stream, holding each other, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. 2 months ago, she'd been counting her last 3 coins and contemplating a desperate future. Now she was in the arms of a man who made her feel safe and cherished and seen. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we figure it out together." Ben kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose, making her laugh. "We take it slow if you want, or fast if you prefer. We tell Cal and the ranch hands, or we keep it private for a while. Whatever you're comfortable with." "I think people already suspect." "Frank's probably planning the wedding already," Ben said wryly, making Eleanor laugh again. They rode back to the ranch in the golden afternoon light, and something fundamental had shifted between them. Ben reached over to take her hand as they rode, their fingers intertwining, and Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. That evening at dinner, Caleb took one look at them and shook his head with a slight smile. Finally, the tension was getting unbearable. "You knew?" Ben asked, surprised. "Brother, I've known since the first week. You looked at her like she hung the moon, and she turned red every time you entered a room. I was starting to think I'd have to lock you two in a closet together." Eleanor felt her face flame, but Caleb's expression was warm, not mocking. "So you're all right with this?" Ben asked. "Why wouldn't I be? Eleanor's good for you, good for the ranch, and if she's fool enough to fall for your ugly face, that's her choice." Caleb's tone was teasing, but there was genuine affection underneath. "Your brother isn't ugly," Eleanor protested, then immediately regretted it as both men laughed. "She's definitely in love with you," Caleb said to Ben. "Only someone besotted would defend your appearance." As autumn deepened into winter, Eleanor's relationship with Ben blossomed. They were discreet around the ranch hands, not wanting to create gossip or complications, but in private moments they were learning each other. Ben taught Eleanor to ride better, taking her on longer excursions around the ranch. Eleanor taught Ben to appreciate poetry, reading to him on quiet evenings. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Eleanor learned that Ben had always felt responsible for everyone around him, a burden he'd carried since his father died, that he loved the ranch but sometimes felt trapped by the responsibility, that he wanted a family someday, children who could grow up with more security than he'd had. Ben learned that Eleanor's father had been charming but unreliable, always chasing the next big scheme while ignoring practical responsibilities, that she'd basically run their household from the age of 15, managing what little money they had, that she'd once dreamed of becoming a teacher but had never had the opportunity. "You still could," Ben said one evening as they sat together on the porch, Eleanor leaning against his shoulder. "Teach, I mean. Marysvale's been trying to get a proper school teacher for years. I don't have formal training. You're better educated than most people in this territory. You could make a real difference." The idea took root in Eleanor's mind. She mentioned it to Frank, who was enthusiastic. She mentioned it to Caleb, who thought it was a fine idea. She even mentioned it to some of the ranch hands, several of whom had children in town, who were growing up with minimal education. By early December, Eleanor found herself riding into Marysvale with Ben to meet with the town council about a teaching position. The same town that had seemed so hostile and unwelcoming just 4 months ago now greeted her warmly, at least in part because she came recommended by the Cole brothers, who were respected in the community. The town council offered her a position starting after the new year, teaching children of all ages in a small schoolhouse. The pay was modest, but combined with her work at the ranch, it would give Eleanor true financial independence. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Ben asked as they drove back to the ranch after the meeting. Snow was falling lightly, dusting the landscape with white. "I'm sure. But Ben, I want to keep working at the ranch too, at least part-time. The books, helping Frank, being there, it's my home now." "It is your home." Ben pulled the wagon to a stop on the empty road and turned to face her. His expression was serious, his eyes intense. "Eleanor, I love you. I think I've loved you since I saw you counting those 3 coins with your chin up, refusing to be defeated. You're the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Eleanor's heart seemed to stop, then start again at double speed. Ben. Marry me. I know it's only been a few months and maybe that's too fast, but I've never been more certain of anything. Marry me and we'll make the ranch our home together. We'll teach the town children and raise cattle and build a life. We'll have those kids I told you I wanted, and you'll keep organizing my disaster of an office, and I'll kiss you every morning and every night, and we'll figure out the rest as we go. Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face, but she was smiling so wide it almost hurt. Yes, of course I'll marry you. Ben let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses, then pulled Eleanor into his arms, kissing her with such enthusiasm that her hat fell off. They laughed and kissed and held each other as the snow fell around them, and Eleanor thought about how far she'd come from that desperate woman counting her last 3 coins in a saloon. I don't have a ring, Ben said eventually, looking chagrined. I should have planned this better. I don't need a ring right now, I just need you. But when they got back to the ranch and shared the news with Caleb and Frank, Caleb disappeared upstairs and returned with a small box. This was our mother's. She'd want you to have it. Inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond, elegant and timeless. Ben slipped it onto Eleanor's finger with shaking hands, and it fit perfectly. They married in January of 1883, on a clear, cold day with blue skies and snow on the ground. The ceremony was held in the Marysvale church, attended by the ranch hands, townspeople, and what seemed like half the county. Lily came from Salt Lake City with her husband, and she and Eleanor bonded immediately, Lily laughing and crying and thanking Eleanor for making her brother so happy. Eleanor wore a dress she'd made herself, simple but elegant in cream-colored wool. Ben wore his best suit and looked so handsome that Eleanor's breath caught when she saw him waiting at the altar. They exchanged vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other through all the challenges ahead. The reception was held at the ranch, with Frank outdoing himself on the food and the ranch hands providing enthusiastic if not particularly skilled music. Eleanor danced with her new husband, with Caleb, with Frank, with seemingly every man in attendance. When she finally got a moment to sit down, her feet aching but her heart full, Ben appeared with a cup of punch and dropped to the chair beside her. "Happy?" he asked, deliriously. "You?" "More than I knew was possible." He took her hand, the one wearing his mother's ring, and kissed her knuckles. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for asking. Thank you for seeing me that day in the saloon. Thank you for telling me my money was no good there." Ben's expression turned serious. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Best decision I ever made." "The best decision we made," Eleanor corrected, "because I could have refused, could have walked away, but I chose to trust you, and that made all the difference." They moved into the main house together, making Ben's room their shared space and turning Eleanor's old room into a proper office. Eleanor started teaching at the Marysvale school 3 days a week, riding into town with Ben when he went for supplies or meetings. Her students ranged from 6 to 16, a challenging mix, but Eleanor found she loved teaching. She loved seeing understanding dawn in a child's eyes, loved helping the older students discover worlds beyond their small town through books and learning. The rest of her time was spent on the ranch, keeping the books, helping Frank, and gradually learning every aspect of the operation. Caleb seemed pleased to have her as a sister-in-law, and his protective coldness fully thawed as he watched how happy she made his brother. Spring came, bringing new calves and the hard work of branding. Eleanor watched Ben work, marveling at his patience with the animals and his quiet leadership of the ranch hands. He was a natural cowboy, born to this life, and she loved seeing him in his element. Summer brought long, hot days and the work of getting the cattle to market. Eleanor kept the books meticulously, tracking every expense and profit, and by the end of the season, the ranch had turned its biggest profit in years. "You're a genius," Ben told her one evening as he reviewed the accounts. "Cal and I were losing money left and right through inefficiency, and we didn't even know it." "You just needed organization," Eleanor said, but she was pleased. Fall arrived with its golden beauty, And Eleanor realized she'd been on the ranch for a full year. A year since Ben had found her counting her last 3 coins. A year since her life had transformed completely. She was thinking about this one October morning when she realized with a start that her monthly courses were late. Very late. She sat at her desk, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach, and felt a wave of joy and terror wash over her. That evening, she told Ben. They were in their room, getting ready for bed, and Eleanor couldn't keep the news to herself any longer. "I think I'm pregnant," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Ben froze, his shirt half unbuttoned. "You think?" "I'm fairly certain. All the signs are there." He crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "Eleanor, that's amazing. That's wonderful. Are you happy? Are you scared? What do you need?" Eleanor laughed, holding on to him. "All of those things. Yes, I'm happy. Yes, I'm scared. And what I need is for you to put me down before you make me dizzy." He set her down carefully, then immediately dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to her stomach. "Hello in there. I'm your father, and I already love you more than I thought possible." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she ran her fingers through his hair. "You're going to be such a good father." "I'm going to try." He looked up at her, his eyes bright. "We should tell Cal and Frank." "Tomorrow, tonight, I just want it to be ours." They lay in bed that night, Ben's hand splayed protectively over her stomach, and talked about the future, names they liked, how they'd arrange the nursery, whether the baby would have Ben's sage eyes or Eleanor's darker blue ones. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Eleanor continued teaching through the fall, though she had to give it up in winter as her belly grew too large to comfortably make the ride to town. She spent those months preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, reading every book about childbirth she could find. Ben was attentive to the point of being ridiculous, barely letting her lift anything and worrying whenever she so much as sneezed. Caleb teased him mercilessly about it, but was also excited about becoming an uncle. Frank started baking constantly, convinced that Eleanor needed to eat twice as much as usual. In March of 1884, on a night when the wind howled around the house and rain lashed the windows, Eleanor went into labor. It was long and difficult, attended by the local midwife and with Ben pacing anxiously downstairs. But when the first cries of a baby filled the house, Ben came running. "It's a boy," the midwife said, placing the squalling infant in Eleanor's arms, strong and healthy. Ben stood at the bedside, tears streaming down his face, staring at his son with wonder. "He's perfect." "He is," Eleanor agreed, exhausted but elated. "Do you want to hold him?" Ben took the baby with careful reverence, and the infant quieted immediately, blinking up at his father with unfocused eyes. "Hello, little one. Welcome to the world. I'm your papa." They named him Thomas Benjamin Cole. Thomas after Eleanor's father despite his flaws, Benjamin after the man who had saved her. Little Tommy, as he quickly became known, was the light of their lives. He was a happy baby, quick to smile, and curious about everything. Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Eleanor stopped teaching permanently, finding that motherhood and ranch management were more than enough to occupy her time. Ben was a devoted father, often carrying Tommy around in a sling as he worked around the ranch, talking to his son about horses and cattle and the land. Caleb was equally besotted, and Tommy's first word was Cal, much to Ben's pretend dismay. Frank spoiled the boy shamelessly, making special treats and carrying him around the kitchen while he cooked. The years passed in a blur of happiness. Tommy grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. The ranch continued to prosper. Eleanor kept meticulous books and helped make decisions about the business. Ben and Caleb expanded their operation, buying more land, increasing their herd. When Tommy was 2, Eleanor became pregnant again. This time it was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. In the fall of 1886, she gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Sarah Rose Cole. Sarah had Ben's sage eyes and a shock of blonde hair that darkened to brown as she grew. Tommy was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Eleanor would find him sitting by Sarah's cradle, singing nonsense songs or showing her his toy horses. It filled her heart to bursting. More years passed. Tommy started school in Marysvale, riding in with Ben or Caleb. Sarah grew into a bright, active child who followed her father and uncle around the ranch, wanting to do everything the Cowboys did. Eleanor resumed teaching part-time once Sarah was old enough, going into town twice a week while Frank watched the children. Ben and Eleanor's love deepened with time and experience. They weathered hard winters and dry summers, disagreements and reconciliations, the daily challenges of running a ranch and raising children. Through it all, they remained partners, best friends, lovers. One evening in the fall of 1890, Eleanor sat on the porch watching the sunset. Tommy, now 6, was playing with toy horses in the yard. Sarah, 4, was practicing rope tricks Ben had taught her. Inside, Eleanor could hear Ben and Caleb discussing plans for the next season. 8 years. 8 years since Ben had found her counting her last 3 coins in that saloon, since he'd told her that her money was no good there. 8 years since he'd changed the entire course of her life with a single act of kindness. She thought about that desperate woman she'd been, hungry and scared and alone. She barely recognized herself now. Now she was a wife, a mother, a teacher, a ranch manager. She had a home, a family, a community. She had love and security and purpose. Ben stepped out onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one and settled into the chair beside her, the same spot where they'd sat so many evenings over the years. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, taking her free hand. "The day we met, how different everything is now." Ben smiled, bringing her hand to his lips. "Best day of my life." "Mine too, though I didn't know it at the time." "Do you ever regret it? The way things turned out?" Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "Regret it? Ben, you gave me everything. A home, a family, a life I never dreamed I could have. The only thing I regret is that I didn't meet you sooner." He pulled her closer, and she leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and sage and home. "I love you, Eleanor Cole." "I love you too, Ben. More than words can say." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their children played in the yard. Inside, the ranch that had become their home waited, warm and welcoming. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but promising, full of more years to build together. And Eleanor thought about those 3 coins she'd counted so long ago, the last of her money, the symbol of her desperation. She'd kept them, tucked away in a drawer in her desk. Sometimes she took them out and looked at them, remembering that moment when her life had been balanced on a knife's edge. "Your money's no good here," Ben had said. And he'd been right in ways neither of them could have imagined that day, because what she'd needed wasn't money. It was hope. It was kindness. It was someone seeing her worth when she'd almost forgotten it herself. As darkness fell and Ben stood, pulling her to her feet with a smile, Eleanor sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for that desperate day in the saloon, for a cowboy with sage eyes and a generous heart, for second chances and new beginnings, for a life that had started with 3 coins and turned into riches beyond measure. The children came running as Ben called them inside for dinner, Tommy chattering about his day at school, and Sarah demanding to know when she could learn to ride a horse by herself. Eleanor herded them toward the house, pausing at the door to look back at the land painted silver by the rising moon. This was home. This was family. This was love. And it had all begun with a cowboy telling her that her money was no good here. As years continued to unfold at the Garrett Ranch, life brought its share of challenges and triumphs. Tommy grew tall and lean like his father, spending every spare moment learning the cattle business. By the time he was 12, he could rope and brand with the best of the ranch hands. Sarah, meanwhile, proved to have a gift with horses that surprised everyone. She could gentle the wildest colt, seemed to speak a language the animals understood. Eleanor expanded her teaching, eventually becoming the head teacher at the Marysvale school. She trained new teachers who came to the growing town, developed curriculum, fought for better supplies and bigger schoolrooms. Ben supported her fully, proud of the difference she made in young lives. Caleb eventually married a widow named Martha who had a young son. She integrated seamlessly into the ranch family, and Eleanor finally had another woman to talk to among all the Cowboys. Their families grew close, their children growing up more like siblings than cousins. The ranch continued to prosper under the Cole brothers' management and Eleanor's keen financial oversight. They weathered droughts and hard winters, market downturns, and disease outbreaks, but they weathered them together. The family bond strong enough to hold through any storm. In 1895, Eleanor became pregnant once more, a surprise at 33. She gave birth to another boy, whom they named Daniel. Tommy and Sarah adored their baby brother, fighting over who got to hold him. Ben, now in his 40s, found himself starting over with midnight feedings and diaper changes, but he did so with joy and patience. As the century drew to a close, the West was changing. The wild frontier was becoming settled, civilized. Railroads connected towns that had once been isolated. Telegraph lines brought news from across the country in hours instead of weeks. The world was getting smaller, faster, but some things remained constant. The land endured, harsh and beautiful. Cattle still needed tending. Children still needed teaching. And every day Ben still found moments to pull Eleanor close and tell her he loved her. One evening in the spring of 1899, they stood together on their porch, watching yet another spectacular sunset. 17 years since that day in the saloon. They were older now, with lines on their faces and silver threading through their hair, but they held hands like young lovers, comfortable in a way that only comes with years of partnership. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Eleanor asked. "In the saloon?" "Your money's no good here," Ben replied without hesitation. "I remember everything about that day." "You changed my entire life with those words. We changed each other's lives." He turned to face her, his hands coming up to frame her face the way he'd done that day by the stream when he first kissed her. "You gave me purpose beyond just running a ranch. You gave me a family, a real home. You made me believe in possibilities I'd stopped imagining." Eleanor rose on her toes to kiss him, the gesture as natural now as breathing after 17 years of marriage. "I was counting my last 3 coins and preparing for the worst, and then you appeared like an answer to a prayer. Divine intervention," Ben said with a smile. "Or just dumb luck that I walked into that saloon at exactly the right moment." "Not luck, fate. It had to be fate that brought us together." They went inside as full darkness fell, into the house filled with the sounds of their family. Tommy was reading to Daniel, doing funny voices that made his little brother giggle. Sarah was helping Martha and Frank with dinner preparations, chattering about a horse she was training. Caleb was going over accounts at the dining table, his reading glasses perched on his nose. This was what Eleanor had built from those 3 desperate coins. Not just a house, but a home. Not just survival, but a thriving life full of love and purpose and connection. As she took her seat at the dinner table surrounded by her family, Eleanor caught Ben's eye across the chaos. He winked at her, and she felt her heart do that familiar flutter it had done since the beginning. Some love stories begin with grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Theirs had begun with a simple act of kindness, a cowboy telling a desperate woman that her money was no good. But from that small beginning had grown something remarkable and enduring. After dinner, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Ben and Eleanor retired to their room. They'd moved to a larger bedroom years ago when their family expanded, but they'd kept the same quilt that had been on the bed that first night Eleanor stayed at the ranch. "What are you thinking?" Ben asked as they lay in bed, Eleanor's head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am, how different my life could have been." "Eleanor, there's something I've never told you." Ben's voice was serious, and Eleanor lifted her head to look at him. That day in the saloon when I saw you counting those coins, I was actually on my way to California. I'd had a fight with Cal about the ranch, about whether I wanted to keep doing this for the rest of my life. I was frustrated and restless, and I decided to just leave. Let Cal have the ranch. Go make my fortune somewhere else. Eleanor stared at him in shock. You were leaving? I had my bags packed in the wagon. I only stopped in the saloon to have one last drink before I rode out. And then I saw you, and everything changed. I couldn't leave knowing you needed help. And once I'd offered you the job, I couldn't leave you and Cal to deal with the chaos I'd created. So I stayed. And then I fell in love with you, and suddenly I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. So I saved you too, Eleanor said softly. Just like you saved me. We saved each other. Ben pulled her close again. That's what love is, I think. Two people making each other better, stronger, choosing each other every day. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, secure in a love that had been tested by time and proven true. The new century arrived with celebration and hope. The Garrett Ranch entered the 1900s as one of the most successful operations in Utah, a testament to hard work, smart management, and family unity. Tommy, now 16, was already proving himself as capable as any of the hired hands. Sarah, at 14, had started breeding horses, developing a reputation for quality animals. Young Daniel was the family delight, cheerful and curious about everything. Eleanor looked back on her journey with wonder. From that desperate woman counting her last 3 coins to this life of abundance and love had seemed impossible, yet here she was. She'd become a pillar of the community, a respected teacher, a successful ranch manager, a devoted mother and wife. And it had all started because a cowboy with kind eyes had told her that her money was no good. On a warm summer evening in 1901, the family gathered for Tommy's 18th birthday. The ranch hands joined them, along with Caleb's family and half the town. There was food and music and laughter, the kind of celebration that Eleanor had once thought would never be part of her life again. Ben stood to make a toast, raising his glass. To my son, now a man, and to all of you who've made this ranch a success and our family complete. But most of all, he turned to Eleanor, his eyes warm with love. To my wife, who took a chance on a dusty cowboy in a ramshackle ranch and turned it into a home worth having. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as everyone raised their glasses to her. She looked around at all these faces, these people who had become her family, her community, her world. And to the man who saw me at my lowest moment and offered help without hesitation, she replied, raising her own glass. Who told me my money was no good when kindness was what I really needed. Everything good in my life started that day. They drank, and then the party continued with music and dancing. Ben swept Eleanor into his arms for a waltz, and she went willingly, following his lead as naturally as breathing. Happy? He asked, the question he'd been asking her for nearly 20 years. Deliriously, she answered, the response that was always true. You? More than I ever dreamed possible. He spun her under his arm, making her laugh. I love you, Eleanor Cole. I loved you when you were counting those 3 coins. I loved you when you were pregnant with Tommy and couldn't see your own feet. I loved you through every moment of the last 19 years, and I'll love you for all the years to come. That's good, Eleanor said, blinking back happy tears, because you're stuck with me. Best thing that ever happened to me being stuck with you. They danced under the stars, surrounded by family and friends, their children laughing nearby, the ranch stretching out around them in all directions. This was the life they'd built together, brick by brick, day by day, choice by choice. And to think it had all begun with 3 copper coins and a cowboy's kindness. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, Eleanor found herself back on the porch with Ben, their familiar spot. Sarah and Tommy were walking guests to their wagons. Daniel had fallen asleep in Caleb's arms and been carried to bed. The ranch was settling into nighttime quiet. Remember when this porch was where we'd steal moments alone because we were trying to be discreet? Eleanor asked with a smile. I remember thinking I'd die if I couldn't kiss you soon, Ben replied. And then I'd look at you and think it was worth the wait to do things right. You've always done things right. Even that first day you were respectful and kind without expecting anything in return. I expected you to eat the food I bought you, Ben said with mock indignation, and you did, so technically you owed me. Eleanor laughed and swatted his arm. Is that how you remember it? That's exactly how I remember it. He caught her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her palm. You were so proud and scared and trying so hard to be brave. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I thought you were either crazy or too good to be true. Turns out I was a little of both. Ben stood and pulled her to her feet. Come on, let's go to bed. Morning comes early. It always has, and we've never minded. They went inside, through the house they'd made into a home, past rooms where their children slept, up the stairs to the bedroom they'd shared for nearly 2 decades. They got ready for bed with the comfortable routine of long marriage, but there was still a spark there, still the thrill of knowing this person chose you and keeps choosing you. As they settled under the covers, Eleanor thought about that woman she'd been so long ago. Desperate, alone, down to her last 3 coins. If she could go back and tell that woman what was coming, all the joy and love and family that lay ahead, would she believe it? Probably not. It would have seemed too much like a fairy tale, but it wasn't a fairy tale. It was real life with all its complications and challenges. They'd worked hard for what they had. They'd faced difficulties and overcome them together. They'd built something lasting and true. I love you, Eleanor whispered into the darkness. I love you too, Ben whispered back. Always have, always will. And in the morning, they'd wake up and do it all again. Tend the ranch, raise their children, support each other, build their life. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Because 19 years ago, a cowboy had walked into a saloon and seen a woman counting her last 3 coins, and instead of walking past, instead of minding his own business, he'd stopped and helped. Your money's no good here. 5 simple words that had changed 2 lives forever. As Eleanor drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, in the house filled with their children, on the ranch that had become her home, she thought about those 3 coins one last time. They were still in her desk drawer downstairs, kept as a reminder of where she'd been and how far she'd come, but she didn't need them to remember. She lived that miracle every single day, in every smile from her children, in every sunset watched from the porch, in every touch from the man who'd saved her and let her save him right back. The years continued their steady march forward. The children grew up strong and capable, each finding their own path while remaining connected to the ranch and family. Tommy eventually took over much of the day-to-day operations, working alongside Ben and Caleb. Sarah married a neighboring rancher and started her own horse breeding business. Daniel surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for engineering, eventually leaving for college back east but returning every summer to help with the ranch work. Ben and Eleanor grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They became grandparents, watching with joy as their children started families of their own. The ranch remained prosperous, adapted to changing times while keeping its essential character. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1908, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. 3 generations now, all stemming from that chance encounter in a saloon so many years before. After dinner, Ben and Eleanor slipped away to their porch, needing a moment of quiet amid the joyful chaos. They sat in their familiar spots, holding hands, watching another spectacular sunset. 25 years, Eleanor marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like forever. The best 25 years of my life, Ben said, and I'm hoping for at least 25 more. That would make us quite elderly, Eleanor pointed out with a smile. I don't care. I want every moment I can get with you. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after years of being together. Inside, they could hear their family laughing, talking, living. This was their legacy, this love and family they'd built from nothing. "Do you still have them?" Ben asked suddenly. "The 3 coins?" Eleanor smiled. She'd known he remembered. "Of course. They're in my desk, right where they've always been." "Can I see them?" Curious, Eleanor went inside and retrieved the small wooden box where she kept the coins. She brought it back to the porch and opened it, revealing the 2 pennies and the nickel, tarnished now with age, but still recognizable. Ben took one of the pennies and held it up to catch the fading light. 7 cents. That's what stood between you and complete destitution. And then you appeared and told me my money was no good. Eleanor took the penny from him and held it, feeling its weight. These coins are the most valuable things I own because they remind me of what really matters. Not money, but kindness. Not wealth, but love. Not what you have, but who you have it with. Ben pulled her close, and she leaned against him, the wooden box with its precious pennies resting in her lap. "I'm glad I walked into that saloon that day. So am I. Best moment of my life, even though I didn't know it then." "Want to know a secret?" Ben's voice was soft. "I still have the money I left on the table that day. Well, not the actual bills. But I took that amount out of my pocket when I got home and put it in a box. I've never spent it. It felt too important somehow." Eleanor twisted to look up at him in surprise. "Really? Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I don't know. It seemed too sentimental, I guess. But that money bought more than a meal. It bought us a future together. We should give it to Tommy," Eleanor said suddenly. "The coins and your money both. Tell him the story. Make sure it gets passed down. I want our grandchildren to know how this all started." "That's a good idea." Ben kissed the top of her head. "Though knowing our son, he'll probably claim he knew all along that his parents were ridiculously romantic." Eleanor laughed. "He'd be right." They went back inside eventually, rejoining the celebration. But later that night, they called Tommy aside and told him the full story. Every detail from that day in the saloon to their wedding to this moment 25 years later. They gave him the 3 coins and Ben's carefully saved money, making him promise to pass it down to his own children with the story. Tommy held the coins carefully, looking at them with new understanding. "I always wondered why you kept pennies in a box. I thought maybe you were just being practical, saving every cent." "Those aren't just pennies," Eleanor told him. "They're hope and possibility and second chances. They're proof that kindness matters and that the smallest gestures can change everything." "I'll guard them with my life," Tommy promised, "and I'll make sure every generation knows the story." As the party finally wound down and people began heading to bed, Ben and Eleanor found themselves alone in their room once more. They got ready for bed slowly, tired but happy, fulfilled in a way that went bone deep. "Thank you," Eleanor said as they slipped under the covers. "For what?" "For seeing me that day. Really seeing me, not just looking past me like everyone else did. For caring enough to help. For giving me a chance when I desperately needed one. Thank you for taking that chance, for trusting me, for building this life with me." Ben pulled her close, her head finding its familiar spot on his chest. "I can't imagine my life without you in it." "You almost had one. If you'd left for California like you planned, but I didn't. I stayed because of you. Best decision I ever made." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, as they had for 25 years, as they would for however many years remained to them. The world kept changing around them. Cars began to appear on the roads. Electricity came to Marysvale. The telephone brought instant communication, but through it all, the Garrett Ranch endured, and Ben and Eleanor's love endured with it. They did get their 25 more years, and then some. They lived to see their grandchildren grow, to celebrate golden anniversaries, to become beloved pillars of the community. The ranch passed to Tommy and then to his children, but Ben and Eleanor remained active and engaged until well into their 80s. When Ben finally died in 1932 at the age of 76, he went peacefully in his sleep with Eleanor holding his hand. He'd lived a full life, seen the world change in ways he never could have imagined, and loved one woman with constant devotion for 50 years. Eleanor lived another 3 years after Ben passed, and though she missed him terribly, she was sustained by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. She remained sharp and engaged until the very end, still telling stories about the old days, still teaching anyone who would listen about what really mattered in life. The night before she died, Eleanor's family gathered around her bedside. She was weak but lucid, and she wanted to tell them one more time about the 3 coins, about the cowboy who'd saved her, about the life they'd built together from nothing. "Your money's no good here," she said, her voice soft but clear. "That's what he told me, and he was right, because money was never going to save me. It took kindness and love and giving someone a chance." She looked around at all the faces surrounding her, every one of them there because of that day in the saloon. "That's what I want you to remember. Be kind. Help when you can. You never know when a small gesture might change someone's entire life." She died peacefully that night, and when her children sorted through her things, they found letters Ben had written her over the years, poems she'd written about him, a whole history of a love that had transformed 2 lives and created a legacy that would endure for generations. The 3 coins in Ben's money, carefully preserved, were passed down exactly as promised. Each generation heard the story of how Eleanor Walsh, down to her last 3 coins, had met Bennett Cole, the cowboy who told her that her money was no good, how from that chance meeting had sprung a love story that lasted a lifetime and a family that would continue long after they were gone. And every time the story was told, it was told in its entirety, just as it had happened. Because it was a story worth telling, a reminder that even in your darkest moments, salvation might be just around the corner. That kindness ripples outward in ways you can't imagine. That love, real love, built on mutual respect and partnership and choice, can transform everything. The Garrett Ranch still stands, still run by descendants of Ben and Eleanor Cole, and in the main house, in a place of honor, sits a small wooden box containing 2 pennies and a nickel, along with a carefully folded stack of old bills and a handwritten account of the day they changed 2 lives forever, because some things are too precious to ever forget. Some love stories are too beautiful not to preserve. And some moments, like a cowboy finding a woman counting her last 3 coins and deciding to help, deserve to echo through the generations as a reminder of what really matters. In the end, Eleanor had been right. Those 3 coins were the most valuable thing she ever owned, not for what they were, but for what they represented. The moment when everything changed. The instant when her life pivoted from despair to hope. The precise second when Ben Cole walked into her life and showed her that sometimes miracles come in the form of a dusty cowboy with sage eyes and a generous heart. "Your money's no good here." 5 words that meant everything. 5 words that built a family, established a legacy, and proved that the smallest act of kindness can change the world. That was the story of Eleanor Walsh and Bennett Cole. And it was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through all the years to come. Because love like that, real and true and lasting, never dies. It just keeps growing generation after generation from 3 small coins and infinite kindness.